faces there. I'm sure you've all found this. What Zoom does, we've run a number of courses on Zoom now with Oxford in the last couple of weeks, and punctuality is largely fantastic on Zoom. People aren't hanging around over their lunch or coffee, and they're not chatting in the corridor, and people are into the space quickly. So it's certainly much more efficient. So it's great to see everybody here. For those of you who don't know me, I know most of you, my name's Frank McLaughlin. I'm an Associate Director at ETF. I was a long-standing principal in London, and I've now been involved in running these leadership programs for principals and deputies, and over the last 18 months, a new set of chairs programs. For those of you who haven't been, I would really encourage you to sign up to the chairs program at Oxford. Hopefully we can get back there in person soon. It's a wonderful location to be, to get some space for yourself and to think and to meet other people. But it was off the back of the Oxford programs that people said this was really the first time as a group, and actually looking around there was 2 or 3 of you who were on that first cohort. That was the first time that chairs had come together to network and to share their experiences. And people thought that that was an incredibly valuable thing to happen, and it clearly is, as we can see by the attendance today. So we've had one in-person network event in Oxford back in February, which just seems like another world ago. And this is now our 3rd online network event. And what we're, and Evan, so actually, let me just get some, to make sure I've got the housekeeping right. Welcome, done. You're all on mute, and you'll be on mute until after the guest speakers have finished, and then we can bring people in. Please do use the chat facility. We found that really, really valuable. And if only just, it might just be that you might want to register a point. It doesn't need to be a question. So it might be that a point occurs to you as we're going through and you want to register that. So please do use the chat facility there. Yeah, so to today, Evan, if you could put my first slide up, please. So what I would say is that, you know, this is a kind of a dynamic list of challenges that we've built around the role of the chair over the last year. I mean, you can add to it. It's not a completely exhaustive list, but for me, it really demonstrates the scale of the task that we are asking you as volunteer chairs to perform. And some of you will remember last November at November 2019 at the AOC conference, the FE Commissioner said, and I completely agree with him now, that it's become such a big job and such a huge responsibility that we should really revisit the remuneration of chairs, because we're asking an awful lot of people to conduct in a voluntary role. And you can see that there. Setting values, vision, mission, purpose, culture. I think what we'll be discussing a lot today is culture. Leading and owning the strategic plan, and all the way through there. And here today, in large and in Bolden, is something about the balance of the board. So the skills, experience, diversity, and capacity of the board was how it was summed up. And that's the focus of our presentations today. And before I hand over to our speakers, the next slide, Evan. We're really here thinking about diversity in its widest sense. I think when we say diversity, something will come to mind for you, and I suspect it will be something different for many of you. I just thought this is a really important quote about diversity, that in the run-up to the 2008 financial crisis, the IMF's ability to correctly identify the mounting risk was hindered by a degree of groupthink. And one of the things I think we've come to come back and challenge is where boards were really involved in groupthink, possibly in the past. Now boards are much more diverse, and diverse boards are stronger boards. So that's enough from me. I'm delighted that we've got a threesome. We've got 3 for the price of 1 today. Sally Dicketts, the CEO of Activate Learning. Pauline Odolinski, herself a long-time college principal, now on Sally's board at Activate Learning, and actually a chair in her own right at City of Plymouth College. And Jamie Wade, who's the Director of Governance at that Activate Learning group as well. So they're going to speak for around, between the three of them, for around 25 minutes. And at 2:30, we'll come back together and we'll go into breakout groups and we'll give you the task then. Just to flag up the task is going to ask you to kind of reflect and comment on the presentation you've heard, and also then to chip in any ideas from your small group discussions about how you might think you could contribute to a more diverse board. Okay, so again, welcome, great to see you all here, and I'm going to hand over to Sally. Sally. Thank you. If I can have my first slide and the next slide. A lot of people and some of our governors were very clear on, yeah, we get inclusivity and diversity, let's just go for it. What they didn't realise is the impact our biases have. So our brains are naturally biased, and that bias is extremely powerful in our decision making. And if we're in a situation where we don't know somebody, or we're in a heightened emotional state, bias kicks in. And there's loads of different biases, loss aversion bias, negativity bias, but there's in-group and out-group bias. And our brains, which is why as human beings we are so successful and have survived, discriminate and show preference to people like us. So if you go back to Neanderthal man, which is when your limbic system and your first brain was developed, people, if you were like me with dark hair and blue eyes, were friends. Somebody with blonde hair and brown eyes, you stayed away from because they might be about to eat you. So we naturally are biased, and therefore we are naturally, unfortunately, prejudiced. And that's every human being. If we can go on to the next slide. So if that's the case, and we're not even conscious of our bias, then we need to really mitigate that as a board, as a senior team. And we need to get as many people in the room as possible, both from whether it's a BAME background, a different class, different backgrounds and different experiences, because that's where creativity and agility come from. If you've got 10 people in the room and you're all white, and I'll say white females with a very similar background, you've got the thinking capacity of one. If you have 10 people who are males, females, different ethnicities, different sexual orientations, different class, you now have 10 brains in the room, all being creative, and you are more agile. It puts difficulties on you as a chair because it's much more difficult to manage, but the outcome and the creativity is much, much better. You also need to gain an understanding of the communities you serve, and that's why we have tried very hard as a board to be representational of that. Because do not underestimate, again, we do quite a lot of neuroscience, role modeling for staff and students is really important. And if your bias goes to people like me, if you never see people like you anywhere in the organisation, and particularly in the leadership, i.e. the governing body, then is it an organisation that really understands you? And will it bring out the best in you? So for me, that's why diversity, inclusivity is so important. Our brains naturally are biased and prejudiced. Thank you. Handing over to Jamie.
Thank you, Sally. If we can hop on to the next slide, please, and then the next one after that. Thank you. So I've been Director of Governance at Activate Learning. I've been here 3 years, and since I started, Pauline, who's speaking today, has been challenging the board to think about diversity at a board level. And particularly the Search and Governance Committee has been really keen that we have diversity of thinking rather than just diversity of as defined by different characteristics. So we've approached that in a few different ways. Recruitment has been really key for us. We've deliberately sought to batch our vacancies, and we've been lucky enough in the last couple of years to have 2 batches of 3 vacancies at a time. And that's been really helpful for diversity because panels tend to be less likely to select similar candidates. if they are selecting several at a time, they tend to select a broader range. They tend to go for complementary candidates, which means you end up with a more diverse board at the end of it. We have engaged with specialist recruitment agencies in both of those recruitments, and we have found that there's a return on investment there alongside our own recruitment activity. Last year we went with a generic board recruitment agency and we got 3 really good candidates from that. But this year we particularly wanted to focus on getting some candidates with a BAME background, Black and Ethnic Minority background, because we're aware that that was a weakness on our board. So we engaged with Inclusive Boards, who are a diversity-focused recruitment agency. And we were really pleased. They helped us to develop a candidate brochure that had a particular statement on equality and diversity and made commitments about what we would do to support candidates from a diverse background. We had about 1/3 of our candidates were from a BAME background, and we had 2 appointable candidates from that background at the end of it. Once we'd got the candidates in the long list, we went through quite an involved recruitment process. This year has been quite different, obviously, because of COVID. It had to be entirely online, which forced us to be a bit more creative than we had been previously. So as part of the shortlisting exercise, we asked candidates to record a short video talking about themselves and their values and how that aligned with Activate Learning. And the panel found that really helpful to get a better sense for the candidates. We also involved other stakeholders in the process in a bit of a carousel process. So the candidates would meet in turn with members of our student body, members of our executive team and the panel, which again gave the panel different views and perspectives on each of the candidates. We also finally conduct insights profiling on each of our candidates, which is part of that diversity of thinking thing. It gives us a chance to look at the whole board and the different types of thinking that you've got around the board table and think about what particular types of thinking you might want to get into. On a less recruitment focused point, the board's been keen to link with our internal governance structures. So Pauline is our inclusion link governor and she sits on our internal EDI committee. And she does a great role in promoting the board's commitment to inclusion, in challenging that committee and what they're doing and feeding back to the board about what's happening at an internal level. That's meant that we've been able to set our own governance objectives as part of the work of the committee. And this year, governance will be part of one of our key EDI themes for the organisation. As part of those objectives last year, we started collecting diversity information about the board, which has supported discussions at the Search and Governance Committee about how we move forward in that area. Sally touched on it just now, the importance of visibility. And through discussions at the EDI committee and through a group of staff who've been convened after the Black Lives Matter movement, it became clear that our staff don't really know much about our governing body at all. So we've got some work to do to raise the profile there, to make sure that our staff and our students have role models that they can look to in the leadership of the organisation. And then the other piece that is a future challenge for us is continuing on that diverse thinking. It's been a conversation at the Search and Governance Committee for a while, and it sadly has been delayed by not being able to meet in person because of the pandemic. But there are some great ideas out there about challenging questions and looking at how we can help governors to bring their whole selves to the board as well. So on that note, I'm going to hand over to Pauline, who's going to give you a bit more perspective on Activate from her role and a bit about what she does at Plymouth.
Thanks, Jamie. And if you could go to my first slide or the next slide, please. Thank you. And I have found, actually, I have to say, it's a real privilege to be working with 2 different boards. So I have the luxury of learning from the experience of Activate Learning and putting some of that into place in City College. And what I want to do is just to talk about a couple of things that have already been mentioned. But for me, the first thing is to say that I think the next step in the thinking is thinking about the intersectionality of members of the board and how well we actually know board members. And for me, a simple way of describing intersectionality is that we all see life through our own lens, don't we? We know that because we are the sum of the parts of where we've come from, our background, our education, our social groups, all of that makes us who we are. But actually what I think intersectionality makes us think about is it isn't just about the 9 protected characteristics anymore, that we know that if we describe people, it's a strange way of describing people, but I like to think of that our identities make us a bit like an onion, that we are made up of many, many layers of different identities that have come together because of our background, our age, our social groups, all of those things are different layers. So for example, I would describe myself as a woman, I'm old or older and white, I'm a Christian, I come from a rural working class background. All of these things bring me my values and my beliefs. And actually the more we can try to get understand from people on our board what makes them, what are their drivers and what are their beliefs, the better we are going to understand where they're coming from and how they can help us with that richness of diversity. So one of the things that we are particularly focusing on is we have our own stories to tell, and what we want to do is to encourage people, particularly the board, because they're the role models, to actually talk about themselves and talk about those deeper things in courageous conversations and talking about that what might be their biases and how they can overcome those. And the more we talk about it, the more I think the more we benefit as a whole with the board. Next slide, please. And I have to say, you know, there's many ways in which we can do that. I'm just going to share with you some examples that we've tried in case studies and just give you some ideas. But one of the first things that we did at Activate Learning a couple of away days ago was, I'm putting them up for the screen, I don't know whether you can see them, I'll show you later. We, in our dinner overnight with the board, the facilitator shared with us some reflection cards, and we played a game after dinner on reflecting, and the questions ask about, you know, the deep thinking that people do. And that was just so interesting to find out about individuals, but it's, you know, it's a very good way of trying to get people to open up. One of the other examples I was going to share with you is that we decided at Plymouth we would try to interview not in a group way because of groupthink. So we did a carousel exercise where we had 5 members of the panel, each in separate rooms, and we each had a focus for our questions, and the candidates, the participants, the potential board members moved around rather than we did. We did explain to them what we were doing and why we were doing it, and they all very much engaged in the exercise and helped us with some feedback afterwards. But why I want to share that with you was my questioning was about what makes you special and why do you want to come on the board, but what are you bringing to the board in terms of your passion and your drivers? And we each had a question to ask, and then making sure that we were not biased about individuals, we scored them, and we then got together in a plenary to discuss them. And the first time we did that, it was quite interesting. When we were doing the feedback, we found there was one particular candidate, happened to be a male. He was a very well qualified solicitor. The general feeling was he'd make a really good governor. We got to the student governor, Alan, who is a brilliant student governor. Incidentally, he comes from the BAME background. But he said, when we asked him for his feedback, well, it must have been me. But when I asked him questions, he just laughed and he just gave me one-word answers. He wouldn't really engage with me. So we all kind of looked at him and took a sharp intake of breath and thought, absolutely, this isn't the kind of person we want if they're going to be so rude to our student governor. And maybe there's some prejudice there that we wouldn't have known about had we interviewed as a panel, because I'm sure he wouldn't have been like that if we'd done it in a traditional way. So I think I share that because that taught us a lot about, you know, trying to find new ways in which we want to engage and really get to know people. Just a couple of quick things to also add that we've tried. One of the things we want to do is try and encourage people in meetings to productively challenge more effectively, and again, avoid groupthink. So one of the things that we do is we rotate and we appoint an individual who will be the risk critic for decisions on that particular agenda. So they become the person who talks about risk, about the contrary ideas, the devil's advocate, if you like. But what we do is rotate that so that nobody gets labelled as being the critic all the time. But what we found that does is it makes us think more deeply, but it also makes the questioning more challenging. People get more comfortable with asking really challenging questions because we all share in that kind of process. So that, you know, that's something certainly for us we're finding is a really good experiment to do. The final thing I would share with you is another thing that we've tried, which is flipping the data. When we look at the data for say for the students' reflections on the quality of teaching and learning in their class, and we say, you know, we usually say, well, 85%, you know, thought it was good or better. How wonderful. But actually, if you flip that and you say, well, actually, shouldn't we be focusing on the 15% that didn't think it was very good? And who are they and what are they? And what are we going to do about them? And let's focus on the minority data as much as we're focusing on the positive data. So those are some of the ideas. And what I would say to you is we feel we're on the start of this journey, but the more we do and the more we try and the more we engage more broadly, the richer we feel our board is becoming. And the more reflective, as Sally said, and as Jamie said, the more reflective the boards are of the student population. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much.
Great, Pauline, thank you very much indeed. I think it's really, thank Pauline, Sally, Jamie. I think real food for thought there. We were going beyond people and beginning to think about ways of working and behaviours, which I think certainly was very challenging. So we're kind of bang on time, really. What we want to do is let people spend up to 25 minutes in breakout groups. We know in breakout groups, it's also an opportunity to introduce each other, say something about yourself. But Ivan, if you could put the task up. So we'd like you to do two things in the breakout groups for about 25 minutes. Your initial thoughts and reflections on what you heard, on how activates plans and actions for building a more diverse board and a more diverse way of operating. And the second part, do you have any further suggestions for how we might build more diverse boards in the sector? I think that's fairly clear. So as ever by Zoom, by magic, you're going to be broken out into 5 groups. And in 25 minutes, we'll bring you back together and we'll ask if perhaps you could nominate one person from each group. I don't know if you'll know what group you're in by number, but if not, I'll call out a name from each group. So into groups, these 2 tasks here, and nominate somebody to be your feedback. So Barbara, as if by magic, breakout rooms, please.